Ivrim. Most likely you have never heard this word, yet it is with this word that the history of one of the most studied and simultaneously most mysterious peoples on earth begins. Whether you open the book of Genesis or the Gospel of Matthew, read the prophets or the epistles of the Apostle Paul, you encounter three names again and again. Ivrim, Israelites, Jews. Sometimes they sound like synonyms. Sometimes they carry completely different meanings. In Bible illustrations, in history books, in documentaries, these three words appear side by side, and most readers perceive them as interchangeable. Three words for one people, or perhaps for different ones? And if for different ones, then what is the difference? Why did it arise? And why is it important not only for historians, but for anyone opening the Bible? Here is the first mystery of this story. If it were simply a matter of three names for the same thing, why does the Bible use them so carefully and so differently? Why does the Apostle Paul, in one short letter, call himself an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, and a Hebrew of Hebrews? As if these are three different statements about three different things. Why in one text is Jesus called the son of Abraham and the son of David, as if these were two separate, fundamentally important facts? And why on the cross above his head is written King of the Jews and not King of the Israelites, even though he descends from the tribe of Judah, which is part of the people of Israel? Are these coincidences? Or is there precise meaning hidden behind each word, intentionally placed there by the authors of the biblical text? And here is the second mystery, even more unexpected. One of the three terms practically disappeared from the living language long before the birth of Christ. An entire 10 of the 12 tribes bearing that name were taken captive by Assyrian armies and dissolved among the nations so completely that history does not know their further fate. They entered the annals as the lost tribes of Israel. Over the centuries, their traces have been sought in Ethiopia and Afghanistan, in India and Japan, in Africa and the American continent. Convincing evidence is still lacking. And the two remaining tribes gave the world a name that is used to this day. But how did it happen that they survived when 10 others disappeared? What preserved them? And what force stands behind this astonishing historical resilience? Today we will trace the entire journey, from Abraham and Ur of the Chaldeans to the Israelites of the Sinai Desert, from the divided kingdom to the Jews of the New Testament era. We will analyze what stands behind each of the three names, why they arose exactly when they did, how they relate to each other, and what their history tells us about how God built his plan over millennia. Today, the story of three names that together form one of the most amazing stories of humanity. Let's begin with the very first and most unusual of the three words, Ivrim. What is it? This ancient Hebrew word, in the original it sounds like Ivrim, the plural of Ivri. In modern Russian, it is often translated as Jews, but this is an imprecise translation. It erases the original meaning, which in the original word is quite distinct. The root of this word is the verb avar, meaning to cross over, to pass over, to traverse. Literally, Ivri is one who has crossed over, one who has passed over, one who ended up on the other side. It is fundamentally important to understand from the very beginning the word Ivrim is not an ethnic designation or a tribal name. It is a description of an action, a description of what a person did and who he became as a result of that action. And the first person the Bible calls by this word is Abram, the very man we know as Abraham, the man with whom everything began, the one without whom there would be no Israelites, no Jews, nor that chain of events that determined the religious history of half of humanity. The first mention of this word in the Bible is in the book of Genesis, chapter 14, verse 13. It says, "One who had escaped came and reported to Abram the Hebrew." Note, of all possible characteristics, shepherd, nomad, wealthy landowner, man of God, the text chooses precisely this: Abram the Hebrew. Abram the one who crossed over. Why? Because this is what defined his essence. Abraham's story begins in Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the great cities of ancient Mesopotamia. Ur was a prosperous center of civilization, developed agriculture, trade, architecture, writing, and simultaneously a center of a developed religious system where many gods were worshipped, primarily the moon god Nana. Abram lived there. His family was there. His roots, his social status, his security, all of that was there. For a person of the ancient world, leaving one's native city meant losing everything: name, protection, identity. A person without a city and without a clan was a nobody, a stranger, an outsider, a potential victim. To leave Ur meant to voluntarily become a nobody. And yet, he left. Scholars studying the history and archaeology of Mesopotamia in the 2nd millennium BCE have long noted a characteristic detail. Abraham's very decision to leave Ur looked like madness from the perspective of any practical logic of that era. Ur was a city with a developed culture, writing, and trade connections. Canaan, a distant, little-known land with an uncertain future. To cross from Ur to Canaan meant to cross from the known to the unknown, from the safe to the risky, from the rich to the unpredictable. That is precisely why this decision so accurately describes the essence of faith. And that is precisely why a special word arose to denote it. The book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you." God did not say where. He said, "Go." Trust. Cross over. Abram passed through Haran and then crossed the Euphrates River, the main geographical boundary of that world, separating Mesopotamia from the western lands, and found himself in Canaan. He literally crossed over to the other side, both physically by crossing the great river, and spiritually leaving behind the world of many gods and entering into a covenant with the one God. That is what stands behind the word Ivrim. It is not just a biographical detail. It is a theological characteristic. Abram was named so because he did what no one around him dared to do. He crossed over. He left his old life, old gods, old identity, and stepped into something completely new, not knowing in advance where exactly he was going. Abraham went out not knowing where he was going, so the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews would say about it 2 millennia later. This makes the word Ivrim fundamentally different from all other ethnic designations of that era. An Egyptian is a person born on the banks of the Nile. A Philistine is a person from the coastal cities. But a Hebrew is not one who was born in a certain place. It is one who performed a certain deed, or more precisely, chose a certain path. An identity based not on origin, but on action. Not on blood, but on decision. This name remained with his descendants. In the book of Genesis, Joseph, finding himself in an Egyptian prison, says of himself, "I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews," that is, from the land of the people who crossed over into a covenant with God. The story of Joseph deserves separate attention because it shows just how strong this identity was, even in the most unfavorable circumstances. Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers. He was brought to Egypt, the very country where his entire people would later languish. He became a slave in the house of a nobleman, then a prisoner in a prison for state criminals. He had nothing, no freedom, no property, no connection to home, nor any external signs of belonging to the covenant family. And yet, when in prison he had the chance to explain who he was, he did not call himself a slave or an Egyptian. He said, "I am from the land of the Hebrews." He identified himself with that lineage from which he had been forcibly separated. This is a small detail, but it illuminates something important. The identity of the Hebrew was not tied to place, status, or external conditions. It could not be taken away along with freedom. It lived within, as a memory of the crossing, as an awareness of belonging to a special line, as a connection with those who stood on the other side of all possible rivers. In the book of Exodus, the Egyptian midwives, whom Pharaoh ordered to kill newborn Hebrew boys, are called the Hebrew midwives. Pharaoh himself, giving this monstrous order, addresses them precisely as such. The Egyptians clearly saw the difference. These people are different. They worship one God. They are not like us. They are Hebrews. And here another important detail is revealed. In biblical texts, the word Ivrim most often comes from the mouths of foreigners when they speak about this people. Egyptians call them Hebrews. Philistines in the book of 1 Samuel speak of them as Hebrews, and with mockery, "Look, the Hebrews are creeping out of the holes where they hid." The prophet Jonah, finding himself on a sinking ship among foreign sailors and answering their question about who he is, says, "I am a Hebrew." This word worked as a marker of an outsider, a person from another world, one who lives by different laws and worships a different God. For the surrounding peoples, Ivrim was a word denoting difference. These people were defined not by where they came from, but by whom they belonged to. It is important to note, Ivrim, in its earliest sense, is not a nationality. It is a covenant. It is belonging to that line which began with a man who decided to cross over to the other side. All descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob bore this name. But, and this is significant, not only they. Abraham had another son, Ishmael, born of Hagar. There was also Esau, Jacob's twin brother, from whom the Edomites descended. Technically, they too are descendants of Abraham the Hebrew, but the history of the covenant took a different path. It narrowed, through Isaac, not Ishmael, through Jacob, not Esau, to the next word, a word that denotes not a family, but a people, Israelites. This word is born in one of the strangest and most dramatic episodes of the entire biblical story. Jacob, Abraham's grandson, Isaac's son, was returning home after 20 years of absence. For 20 years he had lived with his uncle Laban in Haran. 20 years earlier, he had fled from home after deceitfully obtaining the birthright blessing that belongs to his twin brother Esau. Now he was about to meet Esau, and Jacob feared this meeting. On the way he received word. Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men. 400 men is an army, not a peace delegation. Jacob divided all his property and all his people into 2 camps. If one were destroyed, the second would have time to escape. He spent the night before the meeting alone, and then something happened for which he had no explanation. Someone approached him, and they wrestled all night until dawn. The Bible says it was an angel of the Lord. Some theologians, analyzing this text, believe it refers to God himself in human form. This is indicated by Jacob's behavior and the fact that he named the place of the struggle Peniel, which means face of God. Jacob himself said, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The struggle was real, not metaphorical. Toward morning, the stranger touched the socket of Jacob's hip. Jacob limped for the rest of his life. The wound was real. But Jacob did not retreat. He did not ask for mercy. He demanded a blessing. This is a notable detail. A man wounded in a night struggle with a being of supernatural strength does not run away and does not ask for mercy. He holds on and demands a blessing. This is precisely the character for which the new name was given. The book of Genesis, chapter 32, verse 28. "And he said, Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Israel. This name carries several meanings that scholars of biblical languages continue to debate to this day. The most common interpretation is, "the one who wrestled with God," or "God wrestles, God prevails." In any case, this name describes a relationship, tense, demanding effort, but genuine. Not of a submissive servant, not of a passive observer, but of a man who entered into a struggle with God, did not give up, and survived. Moreover, he received a blessing precisely because he did not give up. This renaming is not a random detail. In biblical thinking, a name is not merely a label. A name expresses essence. When God gives Abram the new name Abraham, it is not just a change of sounds. It is a redefinition of his nature and his purpose. The same happens with Jacob. Jacob, in literal translation, means something like heel grabber, supplanter, one who goes around. In his story, this name reflected a tendency to achieve his goals by indirect means, exactly how he obtained the birthright blessing from his blind father. Now he receives another name, Israel, the one who wrestles directly, face to face, without deceit. From this moment on, Jacob ceases to be merely Jacob. He is Israel, and his descendants become the sons of Israel. In Russian, we usually say Israelites, or the sons of Israel. Jacob Israel had 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Each became the progenitor of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, that national and religious structure that defined the life of the people for many centuries to come. Note the shift in meaning. Ivrim, Hebrews, is a description of what a person did. He crossed over. Israelite is a description of whom a person descends from Jacob, Israel. The first word is about action. The second is about origin and belonging to a nation. The book of Exodus, 1st chapter, 7th verse. "And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them." From one family, into an entire people. It was this people that God led out of Egypt through Moses, led through the Red Sea, fed with manna in the wilderness, spoke to with a thundering voice from Mount Sinai. It was to this people that the Torah was given, the entire body of laws that regulated not only religious life, but also civil relations, jurisprudence, the agricultural cycle, and relationships between people. It is about this people that Deuteronomy says, "For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth." An Israelite is a member of the covenant nation, not merely a descendant of Abraham, but specifically a descendant of Jacob, having passed through a shared history, having accepted a common law, belonging to one of the 12 lines of a single people. This concept is more specific than Ivrim. It excludes the lines of Ishmael and Esau. But it is also broader than the word that would appear later, because it includes all 12 tribes, both northern and southern. The history of Israel as a unified state reached its peak under King Solomon, approximately in the 10th century BCE. This was a time that would later be remembered as a golden age. Jerusalem, the capital, a magnificent temple on Mount Moriah, whose construction took 7 years and which was built of cedar wood, Lebanese stone, and covered with gold. 12 tribes in a united country. Trade routes connecting Israel with Egypt, Arabia, Phoenicia. Solomon's fame was such that the Queen of Sheba, according to tradition, came from a distant land to personally verify if what was said about him was true, and found that even less was told than the reality. But unity requires not only external splendor, it requires internal fidelity, and it was precisely this that was increasingly lacking. Solomon, the builder of the temple, under the influence of his numerous wives and political alliances, began to tolerate and even support the worship of foreign gods. The prophets warned. But prophets are rarely heard in times of prosperity. They are heard later, when it is too late. After Solomon's death, what the prophets had warned about and what seemed impossible happened. The United Kingdom split. It tore in half, not after a war, not after a conquest, but as a result of internal conflict. Solomon's son Rehoboam chose a hard line in response to the people's request to lighten the tax burden. The 10 northern tribes refused to recognize his authority and formed their own state. The 10 tribes in the north created their own state. They retained the name Israel after the common ancestor. The capital eventually became Samaria. The 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, joined by many Levites, formed the kingdom of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem. They retained the temple. They retained the Davidic dynasty, the direct line of descendants of King David. They retained the original order of worship. The northern kingdom immediately embarked on a dangerous path. Its first king, Jeroboam, set up 2 golden calves in Bethel and Dan, and said to the people, "Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." Words almost verbatim, repeating what the people had shouted around another golden calf in the wilderness. Another regression to the familiar. Another retreat to what had been rejected. The subsequent kings of the northern kingdom, one after another, departed from the law. The prophets Elijah, Hosea, Amos warned. They were not heard. Israel became a country where foreign gods were officially worshipped, where prophets were persecuted, and the righteous were killed. The second book of Kings recounts, "The Lord warned Israel and Judah by all his prophets, and by all the seers, saying, Turn ye from your evil ways. But they did not listen. The book of Hosea, written precisely about the northern kingdom, is full of images of a broken covenant. God speaks of Israel as an unfaithful wife who has gone after other gods, forgetting the one who loved her. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire, one of the most ruthless military machines of the ancient world, captured Samaria. The Assyrians employed a special strategy for managing conquered peoples: mass resettlement. Part of the inhabitants of the northern kingdom were taken away to Assyrian provinces, to Hala, Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. In their place, people from other conquered lands were resettled, from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. This was a deliberate policy of destroying national identity, and it worked. The 10 tribes of northern Israel intermingled with other peoples, adopted their beliefs, and gradually dissolved among them. Their subsequent fate remains one of the most intriguing mysteries of ancient history. Over the centuries, various communities around the world have claimed descent from the lost tribes. Some researchers seek their traces among Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel community. Others point to certain tribes in Afghanistan and Pakistan, in India, in Japan. Some versions are based on linguistic parallels, some on religious practices, some on genetic research. There are no convincing definitive answers. This is one of those historical mysteries that may remain forever open. But in this catastrophe, something important survived: the southern kingdom, Judah. It is here that the third word of our investigation is born: Jews. Or, to speak more precisely of that historical moment, Judeans. The word Jew, familiar to us today, came through Latin and Greek precisely from the word Judean, that is, a person from the tribe of Judah, or an inhabitant of the kingdom of Judah. In Greek, Iudaeus. In Latin, Judaeus. In English, Jew. In German, Jude. In French, Juif. In Polish, Żyd. In all major European languages, this word sounds like a direct transliteration of the ancient name Judah. In Russian, over time, 2 words with different nuances formed: Iudei, more often applied to religious affiliation; Evrei, to ethnic. But historically, both grew from the same root, the name Judah, the 4th son of Jacob. Who is Judah? The 4th son of Jacob, one of the 12 brothers. Not the firstborn, not the favorite. His elder brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, seem to have more weighty claims to a special role. Joseph, the father's favorite, was endowed with special gifts and prophetic dreams. And yet, it was over Judah that the dying Jacob pronounced a prophecy that has passed through the centuries as one of the most famous messianic predictions of the Old Testament. The book of Genesis, chapter 49, verse 10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. It is interesting to trace how Judah himself appears in the biblical narrative. At first, he does not give the impression of a hero. It was he who suggested to his brothers to sell Joseph into slavery rather than kill him, which was, of course, more practical, but by no means nobler. However, at the end of the story, when the brothers are again in Egypt, and Joseph threatens to keep the younger brother Benjamin as a hostage, it is Judah who steps forward and says, "Take me instead of him. I will become a slave. Only let my brother go." This is a turning point, and it is this, according to a number of theologians, that is the moment where Judah becomes worthy of his prophetic legacy. The scepter belongs to the one who is ready to sacrifice himself for another. The scepter of power belongs to Judah. The kings of Israel from the tribe of Judah. David from Bethlehem from the tribe of Judah. Solomon, son of David, from the tribe of Judah. And according to the testimony of the New Testament, Jesus of Nazareth, also from the tribe of Judah, through David. It is this line that became the backbone of all subsequent history. After the fall of the northern kingdom and the captivity of the 10 tribes, the kingdom of Judah lasted for over 100 more years. But its hour also struck. In the 6th century BCE, the Babylonian army under the command of Nebuchadnezzar approached Jerusalem. The first campaign, the second campaign, the third campaign. Each time, the terms became harsher. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem fell. Solomon's temple, which had stood for 4 centuries, was razed to the ground. Jerusalem was burned. The people were taken into Babylonian captivity to Mesopotamia, the place from which Abram the Hebrew had departed a millennium and a half earlier, having heard God's call. This event overturned everything. To lose a country is a tragedy. To lose the temple is a catastrophe of a different order. The temple was not just a beautiful building. It was the place where, according to the Israelites' belief, God's presence dwelt, where sacrifices were made, without which it seemed impossible to maintain a relationship with God, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, where once a year the high priest entered the Holy of Holies. And now it is gone. What to do with faith without the temple? How to pray without sacrifices? How to remain God's people in a foreign land, among foreign gods? It was in the Babylonian captivity that what we might call classical Judaism in its main features was born. It was there, by the rivers of Babylon, as the author of the 136th Psalm would later say, that the people found a way to preserve themselves without the temple. Through the synagogue, a gathering of believers for prayer and scripture reading, through the study of Torah, through observance of the Sabbath, through faithfulness to dietary and ritual laws. This was a cultural and religious revolution forged in the crucible of exile. Historians studying this period point to a striking paradox. It was precisely in Babylon, in captivity, far from Jerusalem and the destroyed temple, that the religious life of the Jewish people did not fade. It deepened and became systematized. It was during this time, according to a number of researchers, that a large-scale editing and compilation of sacred texts was carried out. It was then that the synagogue as an institution became the center of community life, and this institution proved so viable that it survived all subsequent dispersions and exists to this day. It was in Babylon that the type of Jewish identity was formed that allowed them to preserve themselves as a minority, surrounded by a foreign culture, without their own state, an identity based not on territory and not on power, but on text, on memory, and on observance of the law. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in the year 538 BCE, he issued a decree allowing the Jewish people to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. Part of the people took advantage of this permission, and it was they who returned to Jerusalem and laid the foundations of the second temple. Another part remained in the diaspora, in Babylon and other cities of the Persian Empire. But both groups were now called by one word: Jews. The word became the designation for an entire people, with its history, its texts, its memory, and its fidelity to the covenant. The book of Ezra, chapter 4, verse 12. The enemies of Israel write to the Persian king, "Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem and are building that rebellious and wicked city." Not Israelites, Jews. Already in the official correspondence of the 5th century BCE, this word became the standard designation for the people. The book of Esther is particularly indicative. The action takes place at the Persian court in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire. And everywhere in this book, the people are called Jews or Judeans. Yet one of the main characters, Mordecai, is from the tribe of Benjamin, not from the tribe of Judah. But he is still called a Jew, a Judean. This reveals something important. By this time, the word Jew had already transcended belonging to a specific tribe. It had become a common name for the entire covenant people who survived the catastrophe, for the people of Judah, Benjamin, the Levites, and all others who remained faithful. The word had turned into an umbrella term. It is this word that dominates the texts of the New Testament. When the Magi come to Jerusalem, they ask, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" When Pilate interrogates Jesus, he asks the question, "Are you the King of the Jews?" When an inscription is nailed above the cross, in 3 languages so that everyone can read it, it says, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." From birth to death, Jesus is consistently identified by this word. Now, having examined each of the 3 words separately, we can look at them together and see how they relate. This is a good moment to pause and recall the main puzzle of our investigation. Why 3 words if they describe one people? The answer should now become clear, because they do not describe one people in different eras, but 3 different levels of identity that existed simultaneously, like 3 concentric circles. 3 words, 3 concentric circles. Hebrews, the widest. Israelites, narrower. Jews, the narrowest. Hebrews are all the descendants of Abraham through the covenant. This includes the descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, but also, formally, the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Esau. Abraham was their common ancestor. Therefore, not every Hebrew is an Israelite. The covenant line narrowed, through Isaac, not Ishmael, through Jacob, not Esau. Israelites are specifically the descendants of Jacob, Israel. 12 tribes, a single people who came out of Egypt, received the Torah, entered the promised land. Every Israelite is a Hebrew, but not every Hebrew is an Israelite. When the United Kingdom split and the 10 northern tribes were taken into captivity, the word Israelite remained a great historical and spiritual title, but in everyday life it was used less and less. The practical identity of the covenant people was now expressed by another word. Jews are those who originate from the southern kingdom, Judah, Benjamin, the Levites, and those who joined them. After the exile and dispersion, this word became the common designation for the entire covenant people, regardless of specific tribe. Every Jew is an Israelite because they descend from Jacob. Every Israelite is a Hebrew because they descend from Abraham. But not every Hebrew is an Israelite, and not every Israelite is a Jew in the historical sense. It can be depicted like this: a large circle, Hebrews, Inside it, a smaller circle, Israelites. Inside it, an even smaller one, Jews. Each subsequent one is included in the previous one, but not vice versa. Every Jew is an Israelite and a Hebrew. Not every Israelite is a Jew. Not every Hebrew is an Israelite. The Apostle Paul demonstrates this with striking precision in his letters. In the Epistle to the Romans, he writes, "I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin." 3 statements about one person. First, an Israelite, a descendant of Jacob. Second, a descendant of Abraham, a Hebrew connected to the original covenant. Third, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Jew because Benjamin was part of the southern kingdom of Judah. In the Epistle to the Philippians, he goes even further. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee. Again, all 3 levels of identity in one phrase. This is not accidental. Paul is a first-class theologian and a master of precise language. When he uses 3 different words, he means 3 different things. And understanding these 3 things changes how we read all of Scripture. It is characteristic that in his letters Paul uses all 3 terms depending on which aspect of identity he wants to emphasize in a specific context. When he needs to point to the national and historical belonging to the covenant people, he says Israelite. When he wants to emphasize the depth of connection with the original calling and language, a Hebrew of Hebrews. When pointing to religious heritage, a Pharisee. All 3 words are not synonyms. Each illuminates a different angle of the same figure. But here is what becomes apparent upon closer examination of this history. Behind the change of terms lies not merely linguistic evolution. Behind it lies a theological logic. Each of the 3 words appears at a moment of a key turn in the relationship between God and His people. And each turn is not just a new page. It is a new level of commitment on God's part. Hebrews appears with Abraham at the moment of the first call, the first crossing of a boundary, the first step of faith into the unknown. This word is about the beginning, about the readiness to go where God calls, not knowing the route in advance. Abraham did not know where he was going. He only knew who was calling. That turned out to be enough. And in this sufficiency lies something that characterizes the very core of what God seeks in a person. Not a complete picture, not guarantees, not a pre-made plan, but trust for a step into the unknown. Israelites appears with Jacob at the moment of struggle and renaming. This word is about a nation, about a people, about a collective identity. It is no longer one person following God, but an entire people forged by a common history. Egypt, the wilderness, Sinai, conquest. But at its foundation is the same struggle, the same readiness not to retreat, the same demand for blessing, even in the most difficult moment. Israel as a people inherits the character of its founder, the readiness to struggle, not to leave, to stand until dawn. Jews appears at the moment of catastrophe and survival, when everything collapsed, the temple, the kingdom, the land. This people preserved itself through fidelity to the Word. The name Jews carries within it the experience of dispersion and return, loss and resilience. This word is about survival and continuation, about the covenant being stronger than catastrophe, about identity rooted in text and memory, proving stronger than identity rooted in territory and state power. Let us pause for a moment and consider what this story tells us about God. 3,000 years of history, from Abraham in Ur of the Chaldeans to the Jews of the New Testament, and throughout all this time, the same God keeps His promises. Through wars, captivities, collapses of kingdoms, disappearances of entire peoples, the thread of the covenant does not break. It narrows, it winds through unexpected turns, it passes through what seems like total annihilation, and continues. This fact is one of the most powerful historical, theological testimonies in all of world history. Sometimes the thread went through one person. The entire story could have ended with Abraham, who for many years had no children. Could have ended with Isaac, whom his father raised over the altar with a knife in hand. Could have ended with Jacob, fleeing from his angry brother. Could have ended with Joseph, thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. Time and again the story reached a point where continuation seemed physically impossible, and continued. Theologians and historians interpret this pattern differently, but the fact itself is difficult to dispute. None of these people survived and triumphed thanks to their own strength or luck. Each time something intervened that changed the course of the impossible. The same is true on the scale of the people. Israel was slaves in Egypt and came out, was surrounded in the wilderness without food or water, and was fed, was conquered by Assyrians and Babylonians, and survived, was scattered across the world, and preserved itself, was destroyed in the 20th century on a scale unprecedented in history, and still continues to exist. The history of this people is a history that the covenant is stronger than any force arrayed against it. There exists a serious historical puzzle that scholars have been discussing for several centuries now. Most of the great peoples of antiquity, Sumerians, Akkadians, Phoenicians, Assyrians, disappeared. Their languages are dead, their religions forgotten. Their cultures exist only in museum displays and on clay tablets. The people whose history began with one nomad crossing a river into the Promised Land continues to exist. Its language, which died as a spoken language around the 4th century BCE, was revived in the 20th century and became the state language of a new state. Its sacred texts are read and studied by billions of people worldwide. Its traditions are preserved in communities on 6 continents. Many historians, including those far from a religious interpretation of these facts, acknowledge, from the point of view of purely historical logic, this people should not have survived. But it did. The history of the 3 words, Hebrews, Israelites, Jews, is one of the answers to the question of why. Now let us turn to how this story unfolds in the New Testament, and what it says not only about one people, but about every person reading this text today. Because it is here that the history of the 3 words ceases to be only history, and becomes a question addressed to each person personally. At the beginning of the 1st century CE, the word Jew, or Judean, is the standard designation for the covenant people. This is how Jesus presents himself in dialogues with the Samaritan woman at the well. Salvation is from the Jews. This is how he is identified by all participants in his trial and execution. This is how he is described in the genealogies of Matthew and Luke, a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of Jacob, of the tribe of Judah, of the house of David. The genealogy at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew is not just a list of names. It is a theological manifesto. Each name in this list is a link in the chain of the covenant, from Abraham the Hebrew through Jacob Israel, through Judah the patriarch, through David the king, to Jesus of Nazareth. In Jesus, according to the conviction of the New Testament authors, all three lines of this history are fulfilled simultaneously. This is not a random coincidence or merely a biographical detail. It is a theological argument. The history of the three names has reached its point of convergence. As a Hebrew, he fulfills the covenant of Abraham. The Apostle Paul in the Epistle to the Galatians writes, "The promises were given to Abraham and to his offspring," and adds, "It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ." That is, the great promise given to Abraham at the river he crossed, the promise that in him all the nations of the earth would be blessed, finds its fulfillment precisely in him. Abraham crossed the river into the unknown. According to the word of the New Testament, Jesus came to open the passage from death to life for all humanity. As an Israelite, he walks the path that Israel as a people walked with mistakes and failures. The 40 days of fasting in the wilderness are a direct parallel to the 40 years of wandering. The temptations he faced in the wilderness are the same categories of temptations before which the people fell in the wilderness: bread, testing God, worshiping another. Israel fell again and again. According to the conviction of the gospel authors, Jesus stood firm as the perfect Israelite who walked the entire path without deviation. This is precisely why Matthew quotes the prophet Hosea, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Words spoken about Israel, he applies to Jesus. The history of Israel and the history of Jesus are intentionally superimposed one upon the other. As a Jew from the tribe of Judah, he fulfills Jacob's prophecy about the scepter not departing from Judah. Revelation chapter 5, verse 5. The line of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has triumphed. It is this phrase, line of Judah, that became one of the main messianic titles, and the inscription on the cross, made by order of Pilate in 3 languages, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, became, in the opinion of the evangelists, an involuntary confession of truth spoken by those who did not understand the meaning of what they wrote. It is here that the history of the 3 words arrives at a point that is important no longer only as history. The Apostle Paul in the Epistle to the Romans poses the question directly. A person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. This is a radical reinterpretation. Being part of God's people, Paul says, was never defined solely by descent. It was always a matter of the heart, a matter of faith, a matter of relationship with God. Paul is not inventing a new idea here. He points to something that was embedded from the very beginning, from the moment Abram left Ur. Abraham was called a Hebrew, not because he was born into the right family. He was called so because he did something. He crossed over. He went out. He trusted. It was his trust, his faith, not blood and not ritual, that made him who he became. The book of Genesis says, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Notably, this happened before circumcision. Abraham was declared righteous by faith before he received circumcision as a sign of the covenant. Therefore, the sign of the covenant confirmed what was already in the heart. Paul quotes this verse again and again and concludes, "What made Abraham righteous before God is available to all who believe as he believed, regardless of descent, regardless of nationality, regardless of which city by which river a person was born." The Epistle to the Romans, chapter 4. Abraham is the father of us all, as it is written, "I have made you a father of many nations, in the sight of God, in whom he believed." Father of many nations, not of one. When God changed Abram's name to Abraham, the letter H was added from God's own name, Abraham. This addition signified expansion, father no longer of one nation, but of many. And this promise, according to the conviction of the New Testament authors, found its fulfillment precisely when through Jesus of Nazareth, a Jew from the tribe of Judah, an Israelite from the house of David, a Hebrew from the descendants of Abraham, people from all nations of the earth entered into the covenant. The Epistle to the Galatians, chapter 3. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Three words that seemed narrow, historical, belonging to one people, turn out to be open. Abraham is the father of all who believe, Paul says, not by blood, but by faith. This does not diminish the history of Israel. It does not erase it. On the contrary, it becomes the foundation without which one cannot understand what happened later. The history of the Hebrews tells us God acts through the decision of one person to trust and cross over. The history of the Israelites tells us God builds from this a people through whom he works in history. The history of the Jews tells us God preserves what he began through catastrophes, captivities, and dispersions. And all of this together points to the moment when the invitation became open to all, not because the previous history was a mistake, but because it was preparation. The Epistle to the Ephesians, chapter 2. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household. Words addressed to people not of Jewish descent, people who stood outside all three circles, Hebrews, Israelites, Jews, and are now invited inside. Not because they are blood descendants of Abraham, but because they, like Abraham, believed and crossed over. This is why distinguishing these three words is important not as an academic exercise, but as a key to understanding the Bible as a whole. Without this understanding, you read the Old Testament as a foreign document, the history of a foreign people with a foreign God and foreign promises. With this understanding, as the beginning of a long story in which you yourself turn out to be a character, because the same faith that made Abram a Hebrew, a person who crossed the line, invites everyone who is ready to make that crossing. Let us summarize our investigation. 3 names, 3 eras, 3 facets of one design. Hebrews, the first and broadest of the 3 names. It appears for the first time in relation to Abram in the 14th chapter of Genesis. Its root is the word avar, to cross over, to pass through. Abram was called so because he crossed over, across the river, across a cultural boundary, across the boundary between the world of many gods and the world of the one God. Hebrews. This is a word about faith as action, about the willingness to step beyond known limits, about the first step into the unknown. This is precisely why this word is the first. Everything began with a crossing, with the willingness to leave what is familiar for what is promised. For those of us today looking at this story from the outside, the word Hebrews carries a particular challenge. Crossing over is not only something one man did 3,000 years ago, it is a description of what happens in the heart of every person who decides to step beyond the familiar for the unknown, but promised. Israelites, the second name, narrower. It is born from the new name given to Jacob after the night struggle at the river Jabbok. Israel, he who struggles with God. Israelites, the descendants of this man, the 12 tribes, the covenant people, forged by a common history. This is a word about a nation, about a collective identity, about a people formed not only by descent, but also by shared experience. Egypt, the wilderness, Sinai, conquest, kingdom. At its foundation is the same willingness to struggle, the same refusal to despair, the same demand for blessing even in the most difficult moment. When the United Kingdom disintegrated, the word began to lose practical use, but remained a great spiritual title. It reminds, God deals with nations, not only with individuals. History unfolds in a collective, not only a personal dimension. Jews, the third name, historically the latest and ultimately the most enduring. It comes from the name Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, the tribe that became the heart of the southern kingdom. After the Assyrian conquest of the 10 northern tribes, only this kingdom survived. After the Babylonian captivity, it was this kingdom that preserved itself through the synagogue and scripture. The word Jew became the common name for the entire covenant people and has come down to our days. This is a word about survival, about resilience, about faithfulness in dispersion, about how one can lose land and temple and still remain oneself, about how an identity rooted in text and memory proves stronger than an identity rooted in territory and state power. 3 names, and behind each lies not just a linguistic detail, but a theological depth. Hebrews speaks of how God begins with one person, one decision, one crossing. Israelites speaks of how God builds through a people, through a common history, through struggle and law. Jews speaks of how God preserves. Even when everything external is destroyed, temple, land, kingdom, what he has sown does not die. And if one looks at this entire history together, a remarkable pattern is visible. Each of the 3 names appears at a moment when history seemingly should have ended and does not end. Hebrews appears with a man without a homeland, without offspring, without a future, and it is this man who becomes the father of many nations. Israel appears in a moment of despair, at night before a fearful meeting, alone, with a dislocated hip, and it is this moment that becomes the point of renaming and a new beginning. Jews, as a stable term, appears in captivity when everything is lost, and it is in captivity that the form of life takes shape that will survive all subsequent centuries. 3 names. 3 testimonies about one thing, that God does not abandon what he has begun, that the covenant is stronger than catastrophe, that history goes where he leads, even when by all visible signs it is going in the opposite direction. The history of the three words is the history of one God who keeps His word. Through millennia, through catastrophes, through the impossible. He who began, finishes. He who promised, fulfills. He who called one man to cross a river into the unknown does not stop until history reaches its intended end. Revelation chapter 5, verse 5. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has triumphed. The Lion of Judah is the ultimate point of this entire story, and simultaneously, its new beginning. Hebrews, Israelites, Jews. Three names of one people. Three chapters of one story. And all three are about the same thing. About God who calls. About people who cross over. And about a covenant that does not break. A story that began on the banks of the Euphrates continues to this day, and, by promise, will not end until the last word is spoken.